held someone who was trembling, not because they were fighting back, but because they didn't know where else to lean. Today's story begins in a restaurant lit by candles and shadows, when a sharp sound slices the air, and no one dares to step forward, except for one woman, who runs toward the chaos. Not to fix it, but to hold it still. If you believe that sometimes, a hug isn't meant to lift someone up, but to keep them from falling apart, then go ahead, like and subscribe to Justice Reloaded HD. Because each week, we share stories that make your heart slow down just a beat. Now, let's begin. The restaurant was quiet, not just in sound, but in atmosphere. Nestled on a quiet street in Seattle, La Caseta de Luz prided itself on elegance, intimacy, and discretion. Candles flickered low on every table, casting warm golden hues over polished silverware and imported linen napkins. The walls were painted a soft amber, with slow jazz humming through ceiling speakers, never loud enough to interrupt a conversation, only to fill in the silences. Victor Raines sat at the farthest corner booth, the one reserved for elite clientele. Dressed in a charcoal wool suit, his posture was as exact as his reputation, erect, composed, not a hair out of place. At 58, he still carried the presence of a man used to boardrooms and billion-dollar decisions. But tonight, his eyes remained fixed on the small boy across the table, not the wine list. Ezra, 9 years old, sat curled slightly inward. Blonde hair neatly parted, white button-down shirt crisp as paper, his every breath seemed carefully rationed. He wasn't just quiet, he was listening, absorbing the space around him like it might change without warning. And in Ezra's world, sounds weren't neutral. They didn't just arrive and fade. They struck. They pierced. They overwhelmed. Victor knew this. He had studied every manual, every guide, every treatment option for post-traumatic stress in children, especially children who'd been in the car the night their mother died. Still, knowing didn't make him capable. It made him cautious, distant. And tonight he was trying, in his way, to share a meal with his son in a space that felt normal, predictable, safe. Jasmine Wells moved through the dining room like someone half-gliding, half-grounded. At 31, she'd worked enough jobs to know that the best service was invisible, glasses filled before they were empty, plates removed before they were pushed aside. But she also knew how to look people in the eye, how to read a tremor in someone's hand, how to steady herself when something went wrong. She used to be a paramedic, before the failure, before the one child she couldn't save. She approached Victor's table with practiced calm, 2 dishes balanced on her left arm, the third gripped with her right. She smiled softly at Ezra, who didn't meet her eyes. That wasn't new. She'd seen it before, children who didn't want to be seen. She slid the plates onto the table with barely a clink. Just as she turned to set the final glass, a waiter at the next table tripped. A steak knife tumbled from a tray and landed with a sharp clang against a ceramic plate. In that instant, the room fractured. Ezra shrieked. His body spasmed sideways and collapsed to the floor. Arms flailing, eyes wide, he screamed, high-pitched, guttural, like a siren trapped inside a child's chest. His legs kicked against the marble tile as if trying to escape his own skin. Several guests stood up, startled. One woman gasped. A man pushed his chair back too fast and nearly tipped it. Victor froze. His face twitched, but his limbs didn't move. He had seen this before, but never here. Never in public. His mind reeled, calculating how to react without collapsing the fragile boundary between control and chaos. But his body did nothing. He didn't kneel. He didn't speak. Jasmine moved. She dropped her tray with a clatter that no one noticed. In 3 strides, she was on the floor beside Ezra. Without a word, she scooped him into her arms, arms that had carried collapsed bodies through stairwells, that remembered the weight of fear. Ezra thrashed, fists pounding against her collarbone, legs twisting violently. But she held on. She turned sideways, shielding him from the crowd, and maneuvered through the tight weave of tables and chairs. Her voice didn't rise above a whisper. Her grip was firm, but never rough. And with each step toward the back patio, Ezra's cries started to shift, from piercing to gasping, from panic to exhaustion. The night air met them like a bomb. Outdoors, string lights dangled above empty garden tables. The music was fainter here. A breeze moved the leaves. Jasmine settled onto a wooden bench, still holding Ezra, whose body trembled like a wind-up toy losing energy. She said nothing. Just held him. Back inside, the restaurant was still. Victor stood beside his booth, eyes following the path they had taken. His hands were at his sides, clenched but motionless. He said nothing. Did nothing. Every other guest remained seated, stunned into silence not by the child's screams, but by the waitress who had dared to cross the room, lift a boy she didn't know, and carry him out without permission. And in that silence, a truth settled across the room like falling dust. No one else had moved. Only her. The bench outside the restaurant was rough with age, its paint peeling from years of rain and sun, but it cradled them gently beneath the soft sway of string lights. Jasmine sat with her back straight, both arms wrapped securely around the trembling boy in her lap. Her apron was wrinkled, stained with the night's dinner rush and streaks of something new, panic, sweat, and small fists. Ezra's face was flushed and wet, his cheeks streaked with tears and his mouth caught in a loop of gasped pleading. "Stop, stop, stop," he whimpered, his hands beating softly against her chest, as if trying to press his fear into her, or maybe beat it out of himself. Each breath was uneven, like his lungs couldn't quite find the rhythm they were looking for. His knuckles were pale where he clenched her shirt, and every now and then, a sharp tremor rippled through his legs. Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't try to stop his hands. She didn't hush him, or tell him to calm down. She knew better. Her arms tightened slightly, grounding him, not restraining him. She adjusted the angle of her body so his weight was fully supported, then leaned back just enough so his head could find the crook of her shoulder if it wanted to. She lowered her voice, barely above a breath, and said, "I'm not here to stop you. I'm here to stay." That was all. She didn't explain herself. She didn't narrate what she was doing, or promise that everything was going to be okay. She didn't offer him solutions or say his name too many times, like most people did when they were trying to reach a child in distress. She simply stayed, a soft, immovable anchor in a world that had just become too sharp, too sudden, too loud. Ezra didn't respond immediately. He continued to cry, though the cries grew shorter, the gasps less jagged. His fists slowed. The tension in his legs shifted from panic to fatigue. The repetition of stop lost its volume, then its urgency, and finally, it faded into silence. Jasmine looked ahead, eyes unfocused, letting her own breathing guide her. Deep inhale. Longer exhale. Not exaggerated, just enough to model steadiness. Her right hand moved rhythmically along Ezra's back, tracing light arcs, not quite soothing, not quite absent. Just present. 7 minutes passed. It didn't feel like it, not to her, and maybe not to him either. 7 minutes in which the rest of the world, the clinking of cutlery, the hushed shock behind glass doors, the motionless figure of a billionaire father still rooted to the restaurant floor, fell away. Ezra shifted. His body, once taut and recoiling, began to melt into hers. His head tipped to the side, resting fully on her shoulder now, as if it had always belonged there. His breathing slowed to a rhythm that almost matched hers. His hands stopped clenching. One of them stayed flat against her chest, his fingers curled lightly into the fabric, not pressing anymore, just there. Jasmine didn't smile. Not yet. She only closed her eyes for a second, long enough to absorb the weight of the moment, but not long enough to miss if it changed again. This wasn't a victory. It wasn't even resolution. But it was something. A beginning. She remembered the child from years ago, the one she couldn't save. The one whose name she never spoke aloud anymore. The flash of ambulance lights. The feel of a still body growing colder in her arms. That day had taken something from her. And for the longest time, she believed she wasn't meant to hold children again. That she wasn't allowed to. But this wasn't a rescue. It was a presence. A choice to stay even when she wasn't asked, even when she wasn't welcome. Especially then. Ezra murmured something she couldn't understand. Maybe it wasn't a word at all. Just the sound a child makes when the fear has passed but the safety hasn't been processed yet. He didn't lift his head. He didn't speak again. She didn't ask him to. She stayed exactly where she was, letting the warmth of the boy's body and the cool breath of evening meet in the stillness between them. The door creaked open behind them. Jasmine didn't turn, but she felt the shift, the presence of someone watching, someone heavy with silence. Victor stepped into the patio's soft glow, his footsteps measured, but his shoulders tight with restraint. The contrast between the indoor warmth of linen tablecloths and the outdoor stillness was stark, and he was out of place here, like a figure cut from stone trying to enter something living. Ezra had stopped crying minutes ago. His head was still pressed against Jasmine's shoulder, and his breath had steadied into soft, warm pulses against her neck. One of his hands loosely held a strand of her apron, the motion unconscious, but clinging. Victor's voice broke the quiet like a blade sliding through cloth, low, controlled, but trembling with something that wasn't just anger. You shouldn't be holding him like that. Jasmine didn't react right away. She blinked, exhaled once through her nose, and finally turned her head halfway toward him. She didn't stand. Didn't shift Ezra's weight. She just met the man's gaze across the dim space between them. He's not your patient, Victor continued, his eyes narrowing slightly. You don't have the right. His words weren't loud, but they carried the weight of a man used to being obeyed, someone whose tone alone could empty a boardroom. Jasmine didn't flinch. No, she said, her voice quiet but firm. He's a child. A child in pain. I did what no one else did. Victor's lips parted, then closed. His jaw clenched. He looked at Ezra, then away, as if eye contact with his own son was somehow too loud in that moment. He wasn't used to this kind of confrontation, not from waitstaff, not in public, and certainly not about this. Jasmine shifted slightly, adjusting Ezra's weight as the boy stirred but didn't wake. Her hand settled gently on his back again, fingers spread wide as if to assure both the child and herself that he was still there. Still breathing. Still safe. Victor didn't speak. His hand twitched once at his side, then curled into a fist, then relaxed again. He seemed to be calculating something, not strategy, but emotion. The unfamiliar terrain of helplessness. Without another word, he turned and walked back inside. The door shut behind him with a soft, final click. Jasmine didn't move. Not right away. She looked down at Ezra, whose mouth was slightly open now, his body heavier in sleep. The crisis had passed, but the residue still clung to his lashes, to the redness around his nose, to the lingering tightness in his fingers. She didn't know what would happen next. She didn't care. Not yet. Her only job had been to get this boy through his moment. And she had. Not your patient. The words hung in her mind, not like an accusation, but like a challenge. As if compassion required permission. As if a child's pain had a boundary or a nameplate. That night, she finished her shift in silence. No one mentioned what had happened. The restaurant returned to its soft candlelight and rehearsed ambience, the shock having settled beneath layers of forced conversation and expensive dessert trays. But the next morning, her schedule was different. Her name, once listed on 3 dinner shifts that week, had vanished. A curt email arrived from the manager. Due to recent events, we're adjusting the staffing for VIP service. We appreciate your understanding. She read it twice, then once more, just to be sure. There was no anger in her reaction. Only a deep, familiar ache, the same one she had felt the day she left emergency medicine. The ache of knowing you did the right thing, and still got punished for it. She didn't reply to the email. She didn't protest. Instead, she folded her apron, laid it neatly on the back counter, and walked out through the service exit without a word. The air outside was colder that morning. Crisper. The kind of chill that made your lungs expand differently. She looked down at her arms, the very arms that had carried Ezra into that night air, away from the storm inside. They still felt it. The weight. The trembling. The stillness that came after. He wasn't her patient. But for 7 minutes, he had been something more important. He had been her reason to stay. 3 days later, the restaurant looked the same. Candles flickering gently on each table, glasses catching the warm shimmer of pendant lights, music drifting just softly enough to calm rather than intrude. Nothing had changed. Not on the surface. But Jasmine knew. Change doesn't always come with sound. She stood at the edge of the kitchen, one hand resting on the swinging door, the other clutching the hem of her apron. The scent of rosemary and seared meat filled the air, but she barely registered it. Her eyes were fixed on the dining room, or more precisely, on one table in the far corner. Ezra was back. He sat motionless, a small figure swallowed by a high-backed velvet chair. His posture was perfect, too perfect. His shoulders drawn tight, his hands pressed flat against the white tablecloth, eyes downcast and unmoving. Across from him sat a young woman in a crisp blouse and khaki trousers. Early 30s, professional calm, too much eye contact, the unmistakable presence of a therapist. Victor Raines was absent tonight. The man who once commanded the space with his stillness had sent someone else to do the watching. Jasmine hadn't been told explicitly to stay in the kitchen. She didn't need to be. Her name was off the rotation for the front of house. She had been shifted to backline support, plating, prepping, quiet work. The unspoken rule was clear: do not approach the boy. Through the narrow viewing slit in the door, she watched as the therapist unfolded a small cloth napkin and placed it in front of Ezra. He didn't react. The woman said something. Jasmine couldn't hear it. Ezra still didn't move. Then the music changed. It was a minor shift, from jazz to a slower classical piece, strings replacing piano, but Jasmine saw it. Ezra's entire frame stiffened. His breathing, once slow and even, began to falter. His fingers curled slightly against the table's edge. One hand moved toward his chest. The other gripped the tablecloth, bunching it under his palm. The therapist noticed. Too late. Ezra's breaths came faster now. Shallow. Sharp. His lips parted, and though no sound came, Jasmine could see the panic climbing. His eyes darted, not at anything in particular, just away. Away from the room, away from the sound, away from his own body. Jasmine stepped forward. Her foot barely touched the threshold before she stopped herself. The swinging door didn't move. She stood frozen, caught in the narrow space between memory and mandate. She could help. She knew how to help. But this time, it wasn't her place. Victor's words echoed in her mind, sharp and unmistakable. You shouldn't be holding him like that. He had made his boundaries clear. So had management. No one said the word fired. No one needed to. They had reassigned her, reshuffled the schedule, and left her with a quiet understanding that this part of the story was over, at least for her. Still, her eyes didn't move from Ezra. He was holding on, barely. His hands trembled now, knuckles white as he clung to the edge of the table. The therapist leaned in, whispered something again, reaching for his arm. Ezra recoiled, just slightly, but enough. Jasmine's chest ached. She could feel the memory of his weight in her arms, the rhythm of his breath slowing against her shoulder. She remembered the exact moment his fists had stopped pounding and started holding. But memory wasn't permission. So she stayed where she was, behind the door, invisible. Ezra didn't cry this time. He didn't scream or fall to the floor. But Jasmine knew, sometimes the worst panic attacks are the silent ones. The kind where a child learns how to disappear in plain sight. Where they don't collapse on the outside, only on the inside. And no one notices until it's too late. The therapist eventually guided him out, slowly, gently. Ezra walked on his own, but his steps were small, careful, as if afraid the floor might shift. His hands stayed buried in his pockets, his shoulders hunched like he was trying to fold himself in half. Jasmine watched the door close behind them, then let her hand fall from the frame. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She only turned back toward the prep counter, picked up a knife, and resumed slicing lemons. The same rhythm, the same weight, the same silence. But inside her, something had changed again. She had followed the rules. She had stayed behind the line. And still, Ezra had reached for something that wasn't there. The office above the restaurant was quiet, insulated from the hum of evening service below. Victor Rain sat in front of a monitor, his jacket draped over the back of a leather chair, tie loosened at the collar. The room was dim except for the glow of the security footage playing back on screen, black and white, grainy, but unmistakably clear in the places that mattered. He pressed rewind. Again. The timestamp read 8:42 p.m. He watched as the tray clattered to the floor, a blur of movement as Jasmine darted through the frame. Ezra was already in her arms, flailing, crying, alive with fear. The other diners leaned away like waves repelled by chaos. But Jasmine? She cut through the dining room like it wasn't built to contain her. She passed the wine rack, the table of executives, the corner booth where Victor had stood frozen, and she didn't even look at him. He pressed play again. Slower. Ezra's small hands struck at her shoulder. She didn't flinch. Her grip was firm, her steps precise, determined. She moved past Victor, her elbow brushing his jacket sleeve. He had turned slightly, just enough to face her, but he hadn't spoken. Hadn't reached out. Hadn't moved. And then came the sound. Not from the camera, not from the clatter or the guests, but from her lips, captured only because the hallway mic had picked it up faintly as she passed. "I'm not here to stop you. I'm here to stay." Victor paused the footage. He leaned closer. He rewound 5 seconds. Played it again. "I'm not here to stop you. I'm here to stay." The words weren't theatrical. They weren't loud. They were said like someone was telling the truth without realizing it mattered. Victor sat back in his chair, letting the sentence settle into the air. Something in his chest tightened. Not the sharp kind of anger he was used to, the boardroom kind, the courtroom kind. This was different. It was slower, deeper. He reached for the mouse, rewound again. "I'm not here to stop you." The image froze on Jasmine's face mid-step. She wasn't looking at anyone. Her focus was on the child, nothing else. There was no performance in her body. No awareness of who was watching. No permission asked. That struck him. Victor Rains was a man people asked permission from. People didn't act without his consent, especially not in his space, especially not around his son. Yet here she was, moving through a minefield of rules and hierarchy like none of it applied, because in that moment, it hadn't. He had built his life on control, precision, timing. His company had risen from nothing because he knew how to make systems obey. His public image was crafted from silence. He didn't need noise to be powerful. He needed order. But Jasmine hadn't asked for order. She had entered the disorder. He sat still for a long time, elbows on the desk, fingers knit loosely under his chin. His gaze didn't move from the frozen frame on screen. Jasmine halfway out of the room, Ezra gripped tightly in her arms, his face twisted in pain. Victor whispered, barely audible, as if saying it aloud might fracture something too fragile to name. "No one's ever said that to me. Not his assistants. Not his board. Not even his late wife. Everyone around him had always been focused on fixing, managing, pleasing, stopping, because that's what powerful men attracted. Control. But staying? That was something else. That was surrender." He clicked the mouse again. This time, not to rewind, but to close the video window. The footage had done its job. Not because it showed him something he didn't know, but because it showed him something he had never let himself feel. He sat in silence for another full minute, staring at the blank screen, then slowly stood. He reached for his jacket but didn't put it on. His hands brushed over the fabric once, then dropped. Victor Rains had watched 100 security videos in his life. Employee theft, customer complaints, accidents. But this was the first time a video had felt like it was watching him. The building was small, tucked between a laundromat and a corner deli in the quieter end of the city. The sign above the door was hand-painted, slightly faded, Parent Support Resource Center. It didn't look like a place Victor Rains would visit. Not in his pressed slacks, not in his polished shoes, not with his name still ranking among Seattle's most powerful tech executives. But here he was. The entry bell chimed softly as he stepped inside. The room smelled like coffee and dry markers, with furniture that looked gently used and walls decorated with children's drawings. A woman at the front desk looked up, offered a polite, slightly puzzled smile, the kind you give someone who clearly doesn't belong here. Victor didn't speak. He simply nodded once and walked past, as if some part of him still moved through buildings like he owned them. But his eyes betrayed him. They searched, carefully, quietly, until they found the small back office where Jasmine Wells was seated. She didn't see him right away. Jasmine was bent over a folder, reviewing notes, a coffee cup balanced near the edge of her desk. Her hair was pulled back, the sleeves of her sweater pushed up. She looked different here, not in uniform, not moving table to table, but she carried the same stillness. That strange, grounded strength that made people think she was younger than she was, until they heard her speak. Victor stood in the doorway. She glanced up. For a second, there was no recognition, just the natural alertness of someone being interrupted. But then she met his eyes. He didn't step forward. Didn't ask to come in. He simply reached into the pocket of his coat and withdrew a small folded cloth. It looked plain at first, off-white, worn soft with time. But as he stepped forward and placed it gently on the corner of her desk, she saw the faint embroidery near one edge. Stay. The thread was faded. The stitching uneven. But she knew it instantly. It was the napkin Ezra had clutched that night, not during the panic, but after. When he'd finally calmed, when his body had stopped shaking, and he had reached for something tangible to hold on to. It must have been swept up during cleanup, lost in the shuffle. But somehow, Ezra had kept it. And now, so had Victor. He didn't explain. He didn't apologize. Jasmine stared at the cloth for a moment. Her hand moved slowly toward it, fingertips grazing the fabric. Her fingers trembled, not much, just enough to betray the pressure of everything unspoken in the room. But her gaze never dropped. She looked up, directly at him. Their eyes locked. No thanks. No accusation. No softening. Just a moment suspended between two people who had once collided in the middle of crisis and were now standing in its quiet aftermath. Victor's jaw flexed once, then stilled. He seemed to want to say something, perhaps for the first time in years, but whatever it was, he didn't let it escape. Instead, he gave a slight nod, not of farewell, but acknowledgement. Then he turned and walked out. The door whispered closed behind him. Jasmine sat still for a long time. The office buzzed quietly behind her, a printer humming, someone laughing in the hallway. But at her desk, there was only the cloth. Her hand moved to pick it up. She turned it over, smoothing the corner where the stitching had begun to unravel. Stay. She thought about what it meant, not just the word, but the act. Staying wasn't about being present when it was easy. It was about holding your ground when everything else told you to leave. When staying made you vulnerable. When it came without reward. And yet, here it was. Not a grand gesture. Not a speech. Just a cloth. A memory made tangible. A word that had carried a boy through fear, and reached his father long after. She folded it gently, placed it inside the drawer beside her notes, and closed it. For the first time in weeks, her hands were steady. The building was new, but the mission behind it felt old, something ancient, almost instinctive: protect, listen, stay. A brushed steel plaque at the entrance read, "Panic Forward, Emotional Response Training for Pediatric Service Environments." Below it, in smaller print, were two names, Victor Rains and Jasmine Wells. Inside, the training center didn't look like a clinic or a classroom. It looked like a space built for feeling. Soft lighting, soundproofed walls, a gentle color palette of greens and pale blues. Weighted blankets were folded neatly in baskets. A shelf lined with sensory tools sat beneath a mural of a child holding a balloon, the string tangled around a heart. It was orientation day. A small group of volunteers, teachers, servers, EMT trainees, stood in a semicircle, listening to Jasmine speak. She didn't use slides. Just her voice. "No one's asking you to fix a panic attack," she told them. "Just don't turn away from it. Most children don't need you to be perfect. They need you to be present." Victor stood near the back, arms crossed but relaxed. He didn't speak often in these sessions. He let Jasmine lead. But he showed up, every time. Today's session included something new, a live scenario. A controlled environment to demonstrate what might happen in a real setting. Jasmine explained the parameters, gesturing toward a small boy sitting in the corner, maybe 7 years old, with tousled hair and fidgeting hands. He'd volunteered, with the understanding that if he ever felt unsafe, the exercise would stop immediately. As the lights dimmed slightly and unfamiliar sounds were introduced, the scrape of a chair leg, a phone buzzing unexpectedly, the little boy flinched. Then whimpered. His breathing hitched. A trainer stepped forward, beginning the de-escalation script, but the boy's eyes darted wildly, his limbs stiffening. His panic was real, not simulated. He began to cry. Everyone froze. Jasmine started to move, instinct and responsibility tugging at her in equal measure. But someone else moved first. Ezra. Now 12, taller, steadier, his frame no longer caved inward but carried with quiet poise. He had been sitting off to the side, watching, participating in his own way. But when the child's panic spiraled, Ezra didn't ask. Didn't wait. He walked forward, calm, purposeful. No one stopped him. Ezra knelt slowly, making sure his face was at eye level. He didn't speak. He didn't reach. He simply waited. When the boy turned toward him, wide-eyed, breath staccato, Ezra opened his arms. The boy didn't hesitate. He collapsed into him. Ezra caught him gently, wrapping both arms around the boy's back, positioning him not unlike the way Jasmine had once held him, arms secure, hand cradling the base of the skull, rocking ever so slightly. The room was still. No instructions. No intervention. Just presence. Jasmine watched from across the space, frozen not in fear, but awe. She had seen Ezra in so many states, trembling, collapsed, clinging. But this was new. He had stepped toward the storm. And he had known exactly what to do. Her throat tightened. A wave of emotion swept over her, silent but strong. She didn't move, didn't draw attention. Only let the tears come, slowly, softly, soaking into the collar of her blouse. Victor noticed. He didn't interrupt. But his eyes stayed fixed on his son, the boy he once thought was fragile beyond repair. And now, here he was. A boy who had learned that healing isn't about returning to who you were, but becoming someone who can hold what once held you down. Ezra didn't let go right away. He stayed until the boy's sobs had slowed, until his fingers unclenched, until the air between them settled again. Then gently he looked up and nodded once. Not for approval, not for praise. Just confirmation. He had stayed. If you've ever held back, not because you didn't care, but because you were afraid of doing the wrong thing while someone else was hurting, remember this. Sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is break the rule, just to stay true to the heart. If that speaks to you, like and subscribe to Justice Reloaded HD. And tell us in the comments. Have you ever done something that made people look at you like you crossed a line? But deep down, you knew you were right? We'd love to hear your story. Because sometimes, the world needs to know why you stayed.